welcome back to another episode of the Deals for Dentists podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Block. Through these podcast episodes, I'll be interviewing dental professionals and companies and aim to inspire, entertain, and educate you on the best tools and technologies out there. My goal is to help make your practice and career more profitable, efficient, and most importantly, more enjoyable. Today, we are joined by Morgan Hamon, who is the president of the HDA Accounting Group. And Morgan, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So Morgan, you are a CPA and MPACC. Can you explain what those are?
So certified public accountant with a master's in professional accounting. So, with the CPA, I think when most people think of, CPA advisor and what it does for them, they tend to fast forward right to tax, which is certainly important. But, I guess my role in the firm is more on the financial accounting side. And so our mission is to help our doctors, make sure they're realizing, adequate profit, substantial profit from their practice, and then we'll go to work on saving tax. But that's it. The CPA, I think everybody's pretty familiar with that. It's certainly hard to get, so pretty proud of it. But yeah, that's who I am.
Now, your group is the HDAGroupDental.com. That's the website.
That's the website.
So I'm taking it from that name that you strictly focus just on dentists?
Yes, only dentists. So HDA Accounting Group, PLLC, that's us formally. And we do accounting, advising, and tax planning just for dental practice owners strictly. And I get asked the question sometimes like, well, why don't you do veterinarians? And, the answer is it's just we'd much rather be laser focused and dialed in on a very specific industry. It puts us in a much better position to have a positive impact and really help because we know it inside out. That's all we've been doing every day, for over 10 years. So it's very much a niche CPA firm.
Yeah. And I think it's so important for dentists to have an accounting firm that's specifies in dentistry. You don't want to have just your dad's accountant, looking over your books. Right. It's very important to have a dental specific accounting firm. So Morgan, I was checking out your website and you have a pretty badass picture on there it looks like you're a fighter pilot or a naval aviator. Can you tell me all about, I
went to University of Arizona for undergrad. The Navy paid for that. And I was the family rebel. My dad's CPA, I'm actually partners with him at HDA Accounting Group. My brother's a CPA. My cousins are CPAs, like everybody's CPAs, but I was the rebel. I wanted to go be a fighter pilot. So I did that for 11 years. And then after that, I went back, got my master's in accounting and I guess joined the family trade. But I was a Navy fighter pilot for about 11 years. I flew F-18s. I was a West Coast guy, deployed, and was fortunate enough to be an instructor pilot as my last tour in the Navy on the F-18, which was a significant amount of fun. But inevitably, my wife and I were ready to change gears. And so, like I said earlier when we were talking, had to grow up and get a real job.
Yeah, I guess at some point we all need to do that.
Yeah.
Were you in the Gulf?
Yeah, I did an operational tour over to the Persian Gulf. It was a while back. Saddam Hussein was still around, so it was Operation Southern Watch back then. So, we would kind of stay, the carrier was in the Persian Gulf, and we'd just go fly missions over Iraq, just make sure they were not violating that. And it was like low intensity stuff. They take pot shots at us, and it was very, very interesting times. It was kind of right before the big Iraq war kicked off. But yeah, it was very rewarding. Very, very glad I did it. But really enjoy what I do now. So no regrets.
I mean, that must change your whole perspective on life when you go and doing something like that.
It puts things in perspective, you have a hard day at the office now, pretty much, death is not on the table, so it's nice to take that chip off the table. Yeah, it helps with stress management.
And now, okay, so tell me all about your accounting group and how you help dentists.
So like our mission is to, help our dentists. In my mind, like we want to help the dentists like make the money they have in mind, like when they own a practice. So whether that's a startup or an acquisition, owning a business, it's hard, it's stressful, kind of hence your podcast on kind of how do we mitigate some of that. But it's difficult, and honestly, it's not for everybody. I mean, it takes us, I guess, a unique kind of personality to really own a business and enjoy it and do that. And so for those doctors that undertake that journey, we want to help them know that they're realizing, the most return they could reasonably expect from that business. You don't want to own a business and then not make more than you could as an associate, in my mind, right? So I mean, it should be substantially more. So like first and foremost, like my role is to help our dentists make sure that's happening. We do that with kind of various forms of feedback, and then being able to help them. And then of course, once we've done that, once we've made hopefully, that big pile of money, then we want to hang on to it, and that's where the tax planning comes in. But that's really it. I mean, we don't try to be everything to everybody. We don't try to be your financial planner and sell you stuff. We're not transition brokers. We don't try and play attorney. We're just serious accountants, and we just want to see our doctors succeed and make a lot of money and have a nice quality of life along the way too.
And now, so you mentioned you just focus on dentists. Are these dentists that have, one single office, multi-location? Do you also get involved with DSOs?
So our clientele it's owner operators. So we don't get into the DSO space. So our clients are dentists that, most of them, the majority of them practice in the practice they own. We do have some multi-office clients where the practices are absentee owned by dentists, but the majority of our clients, it's an owner-operated practice. I like to think of it as it's doctors that enjoy being doctors, and they want that help and support, so they know on kind of the business side of things are being handled, so they can focus on being the business leader and being the clinician. But a lot of our clients have a single practice, and it's sort of their passion, their baby, so to speak. And so we help them look after that. But we also have a lot of multi-office clients as well, up to about maybe 2, 3, 4 locations. An operation scales much beyond that. Then they do sort of kind of get into that DSO space, and at that point, from an accounting and tax perspective, they really need in-house accounting at that point. So we provide a tremendous amount of value for an owner that has maybe 1, 2, 3 practices, and that's why that's our niche. That's where we fit in really well.
And are you nationwide?
Yes, we have clients in nearly every state, 47 states. We support over 500 practices coast to coast.
Okay, and what would you say, 2021? What's the overall state of private practice in dentistry right now?
I think it's good. I mean, I'm very optimistic. Last year, and we want to sort of forget last year, but last summer, I mean, it was really uncertain. I mean, those were some crazy times. And we didn't really know how this recovery was going to play out. But this year, our clients are doing well, and our industry as a whole, I think, are doing really well. And I recently put out a kind of client newsletter, referenced a few data points on our practice profitability analysis, our monthly report. One of the items we provide feedback on is revenue per operatory. So how much revenue is each operatory generating? And we prepare that just so that we can compare apples to apples across the board. Because, with most practices, you cannot compare a 12-op practice to a 3-op practice and look at like revenue and profit margin and expect that those are going to kind of translate. They don't. But if we look at revenue per operatory, now we can, and that allows us to provide a tool to give our dentists kind of some validation on their productivity. In January, that metric was 18,500 to 19K is where that measurement was coming out, revenue per operatory in January of this year. As of this week, it is over 22,000. So it's climbing. So that tells me offices are staying busy. They're being very productive. Also, when I look at our aggregate revenue across our client base, I think it's up about 10%, from the beginning of the year to where we are now. And so that's very current. It doesn't necessarily, it's not tainted by all that 2020 data influenced by COVID. So overall, I'm very optimistic. I think things are going really well.
Yeah, I see the same thing. And, my practice, which is a single location, private practice, we have 9 ops. So that's very interesting that you mentioned, you can really compare apples to apples when you're comparing revenue per operatory. But I've noticed, this year, 2021 has been strong. We have patients that didn't come in 2020 and they're coming out of the woodwork.
Right.
And they are also very available as far as their schedule. So instead of, they can only come in on a certain day or a Saturday or after hours, they are available, anytime because they work from home. So that has really been very good for the practice. We're still a little bit limited capacity with our protocols, but it's definitely been a strong year. So that's good to hear that that's also going on nationally. So that is such a great metric, that revenue per operatory. What are other ways that you could really tell the financial health of a practice?
It all comes down to, I think, profit margin, at least within my area, in my lane, so to speak. We measure that by just profit margin, and that's the return on ownership. Now, I think a lot of dentists think in terms of overhead, and a CPA, I think in terms of margin. We're really talking about the same thing. So 60% overhead is the same as a 40% profit margin. So we're referencing the same thing. That's always going to be calculated before any money comes home to the owner. So we're just, what is the practice producing? And what kind of income is there for the owner? To really set the goalposts, if you will, on profit margin, we do have to know a little bit about the practice. So if a single doctor owner operated practice with no associates, that's 35 to 40% should be the profit margin, assuming there's adequate revenue. So, with a scratch start in the first 6 months, we may not be seeing that. But once there's adequate revenue, the profit margin should be 35, 40%. Now we start factoring in, associates into the mix, and we just have to talk about it. Are they full-time, part-time, specialist? Are the associates productive? Most of the time they can't necessarily keep up with the owner, but that profit margin is going to come down, and 20, without knowing much about the situation, I would say 25 to 30%, assuming a reasonably well-producing full-time associate. But we just have to talk about that to set the goalposts. So I think it's very important to know where the profit margin is and then how it relates to those expectations, so that you just, if there's more profit than those ranges, that's great. There's no such thing as too much profit. But if there's not enough profit, well, then we certainly want to be part of that solution, help fix it. Otherwise, why do it? Why go get a loan and start a practice or buy a practice if that profit margin's not there? So that is the single metric. Nearly every conversation I have with our clients, that's typically where we start. Where's profit margin? Are we happy with it? Or maybe we're not happy with it. And in that case, we want to take it a step further. Well, what can we do to get it to where it needs to be?
And when you say happy with it, is that typically, that profit margin typically 35 to 40%? Is that what you're...
Well, so we have a large number of clients are more than 40, even 50. It starts to be a very small club when you get to 50%. I mean, that's a smaller group. But in the 40s, that's perfectly normal. So 35 to 40, I think, is the band where we can check that box. Yes, the practice is adequately profitable. Less than 35, then I start to, we got to start asking some questions now. And the other thing I have to keep in mind too, as a CPA, it's not all numbers. Not every doctor defines success by the bank account. Sometimes it's quality of life. And we have clients that say, I work 3 days a week and my life is terrific and don't really want to change it. And so maybe they're okay with a lower profit margin because overall they're where they want to be in life. So I try not to draw like real strict red lines, on these numbers. We just, it's best if we incorporate that in with the conversation, kind of understand where the doctor wants to be.
Yeah, and every practice is so different. You could have a boutique practice that is
Mm-hmm.
just opened up, the Taj Mahal of dental offices with everything, marble and brand new, and they're looking at 75% overhead, where you have others that are okay. So you said 50% profit margin. What are those practices doing, and how do I get there? That sounds
That
those are
is,
rare.
those are rare, and it is, a couple things can contribute to that. One, I think a huge part of that is just the doctors themselves.
Mhm.
Um, and I'll think, and I'll reference a client, longtime client. She's in San Francisco. She's consistently had about a 60% profit margin, 40% overhead, which is really unusual. But she's kept it there for like 8 years. But she does 5 clinical days a week.
Mhm.
It's a small practice, and she just works extraordinarily hard. And I would imagine she's a fantastic clinician and very productive, like very fast. Like she can probably do procedures like very quickly to put up those kind of numbers. So I think a lot of it has to do with the doctor. I think certain geographic areas, I'll get a question like which areas are hot, for dentistry. And I'm not so sure it's tied to geography. I think the location can have an impact if it's a very high rent, very high cost. Um, also along with current events is just some staffing challenges and high wages. So if somebody is in an area where they have kind of low overhead, it's a lower cost of living with an extraordinarily productive dentist, we'll see those high margins. But I'm
Is
not
that
necessarily. Oh, go ahead.
is that practice a fee for service practice?
I think so. I don't always have visibility on how they're making the money. We know what the
Mhm.
money is. We see it coming in. I think the fee for service office is definitely a small portion of our clients. Most of them will take some form of insurance, like Medicaid is a very small percentage of our client. Not to say you can't make money doing that. I had a recent conversation last week with a doctor. He has a 45% margin and he takes Medicaid all day. But I know he's fast. Like he's
Mhm.
very
Yeah.
productive. So I don't know. Like to get to 50% margin, it's sort of like a number of things have to line up. I think that might be difficult to just go out, set out, and say I'm going to go do it. But if you want ironclad collection process. You want like a very very experienced, very varsity level like clinician. You want to be a very very productive practitioner. And really, the only way you can do that too is to make that happen without any kind of bloated staff costs. I guess
Yeah.
that's where I would start.
Would you say that those are the biggest, your biggest factors in overhead are your insurance write-offs, staff, rent? Are those some of the biggies?
Yeah. So the biggest one, absolutely the biggest one is the non-doctor staff expense. And
Mhm.
and to quantify that, what we're talking about is gross pay, payroll taxes, benefits. I include outsourced service. Someone's outsourcing insurance and billing and phones. I include that in staff costs. We're paying somebody to do that, whether they're in your office or another office. So right now, the industry out, or at least from my window, okay, what I can see, industry average is kind of high 27 percentile right now. And it's
Mhm.
been there for a long time. Last year, it peaked up at kind of high 28s during COVID, but now it's come back down and it's been pretty solid. So 27.7, 27.8, like that's what staff costs are nowadays. And that's come up, 5 years ago. I would have said 25% was a good number, but now it's, I think, 27 to 28. So that is one, it's the biggest line item. It's also can be the most difficult one to correct. So we do pay a lot of attention there. And that's where if someone has high staff costs, say we see it at 30%, we don't necessarily just, hey, someone needs fired, like we need to trim. Like we just have to have a discussion, because there are offices that are bigger than others, and sometimes they need a little more administrative infrastructure to hold it up. And as long as the top line profit is where we want it to be, maybe we can get away with a little more staff costs because we're maybe paying attention to our clinical supplies and we're maybe a point or two under average there. So yeah, it's a big number. That's one that that can, I think, most often, run high, and it takes the most time and attention to fix. I don't beat up on clinical supplies too much. I mean, that's pretty much solid pegged right about 6% right now. Again, 3-4 years ago, it was 5%. It's come up due to COVID, thanks to COVID. So, rent is one of those things where it can be massive. It can be a huge factor. There's often chances to address rent are kind of few and far between. You can't just go renegotiate your lease. So sometimes you have to grow into that practice. So I tend not to beat up on rent too much either. Rent should be connected to marketing, because if you've got the sweet, corner spot and high vis and it costs a lot, great, but you're not having to hammer the postcards out because everyone can see you. Or if you're in an internal medical office building and nobody knows you're there, it's cheap, but you better be spending some money on marketing. So I tend to add those together, honestly, if we're just trying to get an idea, like if we're managing costs.
That's such a great point, because if you're paying high rent, for example, here, there's a lot of anchor store plazas with like a market basket supermarket.
Mm-hmm.
And the amount of foot traffic going in and out of the supermarket. And if you're right next to it, you're paying high rent, but that's like free marketing because all these people are walking right by. So that is such a good point that, rent and marketing can be combined. Now I have a lot of dentists ask me, when is a good time to bring on an associate? Do you advise offices on that if the profit margins are good and it's time?
Oh yeah, and it's predicated a little on what their desires are. If they want to have an associate, if they want to grow. And in my opinion, the pitfalls of bringing on an associate you don't want to do it too early. And so, in my mind, there's a window where it can make sense to go down that path if that's what the doctor ultimately wants. And in my opinion, that window is annual revenue of around, maybe 1.3 to 1.5 million and climbing. And you absolutely want a profit margin in the 40 percentile, ideally like maybe around 45. If you check those two boxes, the practice is primed for an associate. If you're under $1 million, and you're just sort of at the 35% for profit margin, I would say, unless there's some other objectives that dentist may have, which sometimes they do, I would say it's probably too early for an associate. You have to have enough patience for 2 doctors and growing. Mm-hmm. And that profit margin will come down. There's no doubt about it. I mean, that profit margin is going to drop from probably 45 down to low 30s. But revenue should go from 1.5 to maybe 2.5. So we're getting a smaller percentage of a much larger pool of money. So it's more dollars for the dentist at the end of the day.
What about associates that may offer different procedures that I don't do? Mm-hmm. Or I'm starting to do other modalities, like I'm reducing restorative dentistry and going more into like clear aligners or airway, and I'm going to be able to feed my associate, more of your operative and restorative procedures.
In that case, you could certainly pull the trigger early. When the associate comes in, I'd like you got to quantify a little bit on what is our objective. Are we adding capacity, right, to the practice, or are we replacing some owner doctor time? Sometimes it's a mix of both. But if a doctor just wants to grow, and maybe they grow, to your point, they're going to specialize in some procedures, and then have the associate do more of the general work. So we're adding capacity. So if we're not taking away any productivity from the owner, we're adding capacity, and we have the patient flow for that, then I would say that window may move up a little bit. I still believe you should have a good profit margin. You want to make sure that's fine-tuned, things are happening before we go add that type of complexity. But if we're just adding straight capacity and the owner's going to stay full gas on what their production is, then you could move that window up. Sometimes the motivation is that a doctor says, I'm doing 4 clinical days a week and I'd like to drop to 3. So now it's a mix kind of between the two. And the more we go from adding capacity to we're replacing the doctor a little bit, the more direction that way that we go, I think that revenue line needs to go up a little, personally.
Do you see that a lot where dentists, I'm 46, are making that jump from 4 days to 3 days? I've heard the ones that do it are still finding they're very profitable. What's your experience been there? What's that jump like?
I don't always have visibility on how many days the doctors are working. And so that's when we get into these type of conversations. I guess it's more of an advising role. So I don't have like a data point on that. But so just to clarify, this is just kind of based on conversations. But usually they're getting their practice off the ground, hitting it full gas, for sometimes 5 days a week. And I think there's just a finite period of time you can do that. And then that sometimes will coincide, because owning and operating your practice, I mean, that's a separate skill set too, just like being, having a skill set as a clinician and your skill set as a business owner, those kind of separate things. And so if you get to the point where you're really good at that, you're a good leader, you manage that business well, manage people well, and you're very productive. We've had plenty of clients where if they don't want to go the associate route, I mean, they can drop down number of days and kind of work less hard, but still make the same amount of money. And that's what profit margin does for you. If it's pretty easy math. If you got a 50% margin or a 25% margin, you're going to make double for working less hard, in that example. So that's why we want that profit margin up. But we have a number, like my dentist, he's a local, he's a buddy of mine, but I mean, he works 3.5 days a week and makes a gob of money, has a pretty nice quality of life. But you know what? When he's at work, he puts in that time and is extraordinarily productive and has that freedom because he's been doing it a long time. It's good at the clinician part and good at running the practice.
Yeah, there's only so long you can keep up that 5 to 6 days a week. I did that when I first got out.
Your average person off the street, they don't understand how physically demanding dentistry is. I mean, they did that, like most people don't get. I didn't get it, so I got in this industry, learned about it. But it's you can't do it forever, 4 or 5 days a week.
Yeah, it's the physical, and then there's the mental. You just if you keep that up, especially in a high volume type of practice, you're gonna burn out. So it's as an associate or when you're first getting out of school, you're coming out with this massive debt, and you got to do what it takes to pay the bills. But I call it blocky bucks. You got to take care of your mind and maybe take a vacation every once in a while. And I don't think I did that enough when my first few years. So that would be some advice to some of the younger dentists coming out. Even though you have those loans and those bills to pay, you gotta focus on your mental health as well. Speaking of that, what do you think 2021? What do you think dentists are most concerned about?
Right now, I tell you, it's not money. It is staff. Staffing, in my opinion. We're seeing practices with much higher balances in the operating account, and part of that is due to a couple rounds of PPP, EIDL, like all those good deal programs. So practices are naturally a little cash heavy, and I think people are just wanting to have a little more money in the bank just after last year. So cash is important. It's a natural, I guess, stress point. But I don't think that's it right now. It is just frustration with finding assistants, finding hygienists. I've heard horror stories of people saying their assistant wants, $32 an hour. Hygienists are, kind of demanding high pay. At the same time, the reimbursement rates haven't got any better with some of these insurance companies. So that has been a significant part of my recent conversations lately, is just talking more about staffing and HR and just running that part of the business.
How much does that vary state to state? How much does that vary?
Um, I'm not certain state to state. I personally, I think it's across the board right now. I mean, I think
Hmm.
there's some
Yeah.
states that could be worse, but it's not really mattering where the dentists are. It's like every conversation that comes up, and it's so funny because even lately, I'll have a meeting schedule. We'll get on the phone to go over their numbers, and they'll say, "Well, Morgan, you might not know this, but like it's really hard to find people." I'm like, I've been hearing about it everywhere. Everyone has those frustrations right now, and I don't know
Is
how
that
long.
is that still because of the unemployment rates and the
that
stimulus? What's going on?
that's what everybody thinks,
Hmm.
and I think to a certain extent that's correct. um you know and if it's not that, I don't necessarily know why people would think all of a sudden, that they're like, take hygiene for instance. I hear that their hygienists are walking in demanding like $50 an hour, and we all know that your reimbursement rate on the work they're doing from the insurance companies is not going to be commensurate with that, right? So
Hmm.
there's a frustration level. But I have not tied it to geography. I think it's everywhere.
And you mentioned cash. How
Mhm.
much cash should we be keeping in our practices?
I think it's a factor of two things. One is just a gut level. As business owners, we all know like what's sort of the minimum level we can keep in there where I feel good and can sleep at night, be comfortable. But I think we can fine tune that with some data. The way we have always quantified that is we look at the break even expenses for the practice. That's all the operating expenses plus debt service. So you know what the cash requirement is before there's anything for the doctor. Whatever that number is, pre-COVID, about 1 to 1.5 times break even was about what
Hmm.
most people had in the bank, and I concurred with that. It made sense to me. You want to have enough money so that rent is due the same week as payroll, and then the shine bill comes in. Like, you just pay it. You don't necessarily have to juggle cash. That's where that comes from, that 1 to 1.5 times. Nowadays, our client average has been pegged at 3 times for about a year. So it's about double is what folks are
Hmm.
keeping in the bank right now. How long that'll last, I don't know. Yeah, I think it depends a little bit on this fall and all, in the news, all this Delta variant and all this crazy stuff. I think people are probably going to hang on to that. But at
Yeah.
some point, we're not going to need to have that much money in the bank. We'll return back to normal. When that happens, that may be an opportune time to maybe make some of those investments that have been on the wish list, and with some of that cash rather than doing equipment financing. But I don't know if that'll be this fall or not. But that's where I think we'll be headed. It just depends on how long this COVID is in the news and kind of keeping people to where they just feel a little better with more money in the bank.
Yeah, I have noticed that, patients they're coming in the door right now. There's a lot of chatter about the variants. And I almost feel like once we get through the first variant,
Mm-hmm.
things will start to, get
Yeah.
hopefully back to normal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but so now, there's obviously the tax portion of your what your group does, but what about,
Mm-hmm.
the day in transactions, month end
Yeah.
reconciliations? Do you help a practice with all
Oh
that as
yeah,
well?
yeah. All of our clients. So, like with our firm, I like to think of there's three main touch points. The three ways we interact with our clients. At the we'll call it the ground level, is every practice owner with our firm has an assigned staff account that actually does the work in QuickBooks. So we're pulling those transactions in every day. We're coding them, we're reconciling it, everything at month end. We're tying out payroll, balancing the loans. Like, all that work is done by the staff account. And our clients do get to know them, and they'll reach out if there's any questions that we have. If we see a vendor, maybe we researched it and we're not quite sure who it is. But we do get to know our clients real well. We know where they like to go eat. We know their favorite sushi place. We know where they buy their supplies. We know who the landlord is, all that. So that's sort of the base level. Everyone has a staff account. Now, when that data is prepared, the staff account does prepare our practice profitability analysis, which is like this full color dashboard style report that we prepare that serves up all this data. Now, if they want to have a conversation about like everything we've been talking about, or why do I feel like I'm working really hard but there's no money in the bank, or like things like that, that's not going to be with the staff account. That's going to be with me or Lauren Dunn, who's also a CPA, former auditor. She runs our accounting department. So we're the resource for those type of business questions. And then if it's a tax plan or tax planning, that's going to be with Courtney, our tax partner, or one of our senior tax advisors. So those are the three main touch points we have with our clients.
And this is all done virtually?
Yeah, all done virtually. In Denver, like I don't do a lot of in-person meetings, especially since COVID. But if somebody like really wants to in Denver, I can certainly do that. But even then, like nobody wants to deal with the I-25 traffic all day. So it's almost all just talking like we are here.
All right. So, before we wrap things up, Morgan, do you have any advice for the young dentists out there or young entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I would say the advice would be, owning, if you're thinking about business ownership, there's a lot of good reasons to own a business. I think the upside is compared to being an associate is very much higher. But just realize that like owning and operating a business is a separate skill set. You'll get better at it over time. So in the beginning, it can be daunting. And, whether you do a scratch start or you purchase a practice, and that's a whole separate conversation on which one of those may be a better fit. But, once you start that, it can be a little overwhelming. And I would say like stick with it, surround yourself with good advisors. And, those businesses, a profitable business that they don't just fall out of the sky. They take a long time to cultivate and create. And it's very fun. It's very rewarding, but just realize that, it is kind of a separate journey. It's a separate skill set. And if that sounds appealing, then I would say go for it.
Yeah, that's such a great point. It is such a different skill set, and it's something we're not taught in dental school.
No.
And personally, I associated for what I thought was way too long. Mm-hmm. And I wish I had, jumped into partnership or ownership earlier in my career.
I think it makes sense to associate for a while. Let's learn some things on someone else's, watch. So I think that's a good move. I'd say that's the majority of our clients will have some period of time, whatever that is. But I think that's smart. It's really tough to do like straight from school, straight into owning. I think that's in my opinion, that makes the journey a little harder.
I would say that's very rare for someone to be ready, unless it's, your even if it's your parent that has the practice, you're still mm-hmm. just, your clinical skills aren't there, your patient skills aren't there, to jump right into ownership, and you really don't know how to be a leader. So for me, I think a few years and working in different types of offices, a high volume or even a DSO or rural, whatever it takes to get a different mix, I think is a great way for an associate to really learn on someone else's dime, like you said. Morgan, thank you so much. Again, Morgan Hamon, the president of HDA Accounting Group. It was a pleasure talking to you. A very informative podcast. Thanks again.
No, it was my pleasure. Appreciate it. Enjoyed being here with you.
Great. We'll be in touch.
All right.